All right, we're back with another preview and prediction video. Up today, Lane Kiffin's Ole Miss Rebels. This ought to be a good one. Side note here before we get started, I have just about done enough of these preview and prediction videos now with enough teams from each conference to be able to tell you who I think is making the conference championship games for each conference and who is winning the conference championship games for each conference. So at some point, probably in the next 3 to 4 days, by this weekend maybe, if not by the weekend, early next week, I am going to make a video with my conference championship game predictions, who I think is playing in the conference championship for each of the 4 conferences, and who I think is winning it. Let's get started with the Ole Miss video, though. Ole Miss had a great year last year, 11 wins for the first time in school history. I don't know if I realized that. I mean, I obviously know that Ole Miss is not one of these teams that is consistently winning 10-plus games or anything like that. But I don't know if I realized that was the first time they'd ever won 11 games. What Lane Kiffin has done there, really in a short period of time, has been really, really good. And I've had to kind of admit that maybe I was wrong on Lane Kiffin. I wasn't sure it was going to work there. Some of the sort of outside stuff with Lane Kiffin, I thought would maybe be more of an issue. He kind of, sort of some of the kind of Twitter stuff that he was doing. And I just don't know if I don't know if I considered him like a serious head coach there for a while. And to be fair, he wasn't a serious head coach for a while. I mean, you go back to his time at like Tennessee and Southern Cal, he was probably way too young and too immature at that point to be heading up any type of major college football program. But in his time at Ole Miss, he has really sort of started to come into his own. Obviously a really good season last year, but they had a pretty good year the season before that too. And they're poised to have potentially one of the best seasons they have ever had this year in 2024. They're a team that is greatly benefiting from an expansion to a 12-team playoff. Not that I don't think Ole Miss is capable of winning the SEC or making a 4-team playoff ever, if we were to have stayed with that model. But clearly, Ole Miss, like a lot of teams that you would put in maybe your second, third, or even fourth tier, if you were to sort of tier out the teams, there's going to be a lot of postseason opportunities for Ole Miss and teams like Ole Miss that prior to 2024 just didn't exist. And there are a lot of expectations and pressure on Ole Miss this season to do that, to get to the postseason. The coaches and the AP have both recently released their preseason poll, their preseason rankings. And I know that technically none of that matters. It all comes down to the playoff rankings that the playoff committee puts out over the last 4 or 5 weeks of the season. But still, the AP and the coaches poll are still a pretty good indication of what the public is thinking about certain teams. And Ole Miss is ranked 6th in both the AP and the coaches poll heading into the season. Now, again, I get it. It's a preseason poll. There's a ton of examples of teams that started out in the top 10 and then fell off over the course of the season, and in some cases even finished unranked. So this is by no means a guarantee that Ole Miss will finish ranked 6th, finish in the top 10, make the playoffs, anything like that. But still, I want to reiterate, this is Ole Miss we're talking about here, and they are ranked 6th heading into the season in both the AP and the coaches. In the ranking that I do, I've got them at 7th, so I'm pretty close in line there with the ranking I did several days ago, having them at number 7. All right, we're gonna preview Ole Miss a little bit. What will they look like in 2024? What did they lose off of last year's team? What's coming back? Where do they need to improve to get where they want to go? And what, if any, question marks do they have heading into the 2024 season? All right, like I mentioned, 11 wins last year, capped off with a Peach Bowl win over Penn State, a New Year's 6 win. Lane Kiffin has knocked it out of the park when it comes to the portal. He hasn't given up on high school recruiting, which of course would be ridiculous, right, Dion? He's continued to recruit at the high school level, but realizing it's Ole Miss and there are some built-in disadvantages, and maybe more importantly, other schools with built-in advantages that Ole Miss doesn't have. Lane Kiffin, I think, is a great example of what you can do at a program if you use the portal correctly. Have they caught up with, in terms of overall talent, teams like Bama, Ohio State, Georgia, Michigan, whatever, these teams that recruit in the top 5 or 6 every year. Have they caught up with those teams from an overall talent perspective on the roster? No. But they have used the portal every single year Lane Kiffin has been there to bring in key pieces who start and play significant amounts of time. And more importantly, those pieces that he's brought in have been hits. There are no guarantees in the world of college football. You can hire the best coach in the world and he not work out at your particular program. You can sign an elite high school player and he not pan out in college. You can bring a transfer in who did good at another school, but for whatever reason, it's not clicking at your school. So there are no guarantees. But Lane Kiffin has done a good job of utilizing that portal to fill in obvious holes and gaps along the Ole Miss, we'll call it 2 deep. So no, overall roster standpoint, it doesn't match up with some of your bigger teams. When we get to the question marks portion of this video, I'm going to, I'll point some more of that out, how injury and potentially depth could be an issue for a team like Ole Miss late in the season. But I think Lane Kiffin's got to be given his credit. I'm telling you, it looks like I was probably wrong. He's got it rolling there at Ole Miss. Let's start with the offense, and we'll move over to the defense. Of course, one of the biggest wins of the offseason for Ole Miss was getting Jackson Dart to come back. He had the opportunity to turn pro. He looked into it and he decided to come back to Ole Miss for another year. He was a guy that was previously at Southern Cal, recruited by Southern Cal, went to Southern Cal, transferred to Ole Miss. This will be now his 3rd year at Ole Miss. First 2 years were pretty good, particularly last year. His 3rd year, over 3,300 yards passing, 23 touchdowns, and only 5 interceptions. And in addition to that, he ran for 8 additional touchdowns. So responsible for 31 touchdowns and only 5 interceptions with the 3,300 yards passing. A really good season for Jackson Dart. And 3 of his top receiving targets from last year are back this year. 2 wide receivers and a tight end. Harris and Watkins at wide receiver. And is it Preston, the tight end? I might be pronouncing that wrong. Again, I don't name these guys, so if I pronounce them wrong, that's on them, not me. But anyway, point is, 3 of his top receiving targets from last year are all back. Those 3 guys combined for over 2,100 yards and 15 touchdown catches last year. They're all back. They also, again, talking about the portal, they bring Antoine Wells over from South Carolina. Not great last year, but previously, prior to last year, was an all-SEC wide receiver at South Carolina. So obviously has the talent and has shown the production. So I would expect to see a lot of him this year as well. Running back, there's no way to sugarcoat it. It's a net loss for Ole Miss at running back last year compared to this year. They lose Quinshon Judkins, and they've got nobody that can replace him. He's one of the best running backs in all of college football, a huge get for Ohio State. We spent a lot of time this offseason talking about how big of a get that is for Ohio State. So there's no way to sugarcoat this or spin this in a positive way. I've heard some of the fan stories about, some people didn't like him in the locker room. He didn't get along, so this is actually better from a chemistry point of view. Maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe there's not. I don't know. Every time a player transfers, you got certain fans that are going to, we don't need him. We're glad he's gone. He was a cancer in the locker room, whatever. So maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe there's not. What there's no doubt about, though, is his talent and ability. And he was one of the most talented players on that Ole Miss team. Each of his 2 years there, he's now gone off to Ohio State. So they're going to have to find a way to replace that. They're going to do that with Ulysses Bentley, right? Now, he was there last year, 540 yards and 4 touchdowns. So, clearly the second option there behind Judkins. He, of course, will become the featured back this year. And again, with the transfer portal, they brought in 2 additional transfers that I think are going to be fighting for playing time there. And if you've been watching college football over the last couple of years, it's rare anymore where a team has like a true RB1 that gets 25 or 30 carries a game. You do see it some. Ollie Gordon at Oklahoma State comes to mind. But generally speaking, these teams are rotating 2, 3, sometimes even 4 running backs in and out of a game pretty consistently. I would expect to see some of that from Ole Miss this year with these 3 running backs. Bentley that's coming back and the 2 transfers they brought in. On the offensive line, they get 3 starters back from last year's offensive line. They also, again, in the portal, they bring the kid in from Washington who's got a ton of starting experience there. In fact, I think he started all 15 games last year for Washington. Nate Kalepo, I think is his name. They bring him in. He'll be an immediate starter there on the Ole Miss offensive line. So a lot coming back on offense. Over on the defensive side of the ball, absolutely knocked it out of the park. absolutely knocked it out of the park on all three levels of the defense. They go getting Walter Nolan out of the portal to play defensive line. He was a 5-star recruit, signed with Texas A&M. We all sort of know the disaster that went on there the last couple of years with Jimbo Fisher being shown the door and the mass exodus of talent from Texas A&M. One of the most talented and highly sought after portal players of this year's class was defensive lineman Walter Nolan. He lands at Ole Miss. They also got Princely Umanamelian. I had to write that one down. I'm doing my best to pronounce these right, which is more than I've done in the past. I'm at least trying. I'm sure I'm getting it wrong, though. But anyway, the point is, along the defensive line, they're bringing in two really talented transfers that I think are going to play. Right away. Princely Umanamelian, or whatever his name is, I believe was at Florida last year, led them in sacks. He was a second team All-SEC, had 7 sacks for them last year. So he leaves Florida, which is a sinking ship, and lands at Ole Miss, which is on the rise there. So a good move for him, most likely. They bring in other transfers from Alabama, some transfers from Arkansas. In total, they brought in 4 of the top 50 portal players on the defensive side of the ball. So it's going to be a new look, revamped, sort of reworked defense for Ole Miss, which is what they need. Last year, that's where they really struggled in the bigger games. You go back even to the Alabama game. They only lost 2 games last year. They lost to Alabama early in the year, lost to Georgia later in the year. The Alabama game, the defense played okay, but you have to remember, this was in week 3. If I remember right, you remember when Alabama played on the road at South Florida last year, couldn't get a first down. It was raining. They had like 3 points, Alabama did, heading into the fourth quarter or something. Just a disaster of a game by Alabama. They did end up winning. That following week, Alabama hosted Ole Miss, and it looked like Alabama was, to use a boxing analogy, wobbly knees, stumbling around, looked like they were ready for somebody to deliver the knockout blow. That somebody was Ole Miss. They came into Bryant-Denny Stadium. They kept it close in the first half, but in the second half, they just couldn't get anything going offensively. They ended up losing 24-10. Later in the year against Georgia, things kind of got away from them there. They lost, I think, something like 42-17. The game was not close. Georgia ran away with that thing. The defense is going to have to play better in those bigger games, obviously, and they bring transfers in on all 3 levels of the defense, and significant transfers. These are guys with playing time. These are highly rated and highly recruited guys. These are guys that a lot of people went after in the portal. So I do think defensively, Ole Miss has a chance to be better than what we saw last year. Now, let's talk about some questions about Ole Miss heading into the season. And some of these, to me, seem pretty obvious, okay? Injuries in depth. This is something I talk a lot about when I talk about teams like Ole Miss. And what I mean by that is teams that have a chance to be really good this year, have a chance to make the postseason, right? But they don't recruit at the level of the quote-unquote big boys. So what happens at a place like Georgia, Bama, Ohio State, the teams I named earlier, the majority of these teams that recruit just at an insanely high level year in and year out, year after year after year. What happens if in week 6 or 7, one of those teams loses an inside linebacker? Well, it's not good. It's never good. Guys start for a reason. Generally, it's because they're better than the guy behind them. But when a team like Georgia, Bama, whatever that recruits like that loses a player, the player that they are putting in to replace that injured player is most likely a 4 or a 5-star recruit with NFL potential, right? That's not the case at places like Ole Miss. Utah is a prime example of this. Of this. They're a 10-plus win team, right? If they stay healthy. What happened last year? Lost a starting quarterback, starting tight end, a couple other key players on the offense. Next thing you know, they're sitting there on 4 losses at the end of the year. They just don't have the quality of depth behind the starters to afford to lose very many of them. That could be a concern for Ole Miss late in the season or even in the playoffs. You have to remember, we're playing a lot of games this year. Depending on whether or not you get a first-round bye, whether or not you play in your conference championship game, you can play 16 games this year. It's a lot of football. A team like Ole Miss got to avoid the injury bug. Sounds obvious, but it's worth pointing out. The other thing is big games. Lane Kiffin has gotten Ole Miss to a point where a lot of teams get. And that is to a place where they are pretty much beating everybody they're supposed to beat. In other words, they're not showing up and losing to Mississippi State, right? Or whatever, some lower rung team. They're winning all the games they're supposed to win. but they're having a hard time taking that next step against sort of the elite, the top of the top, right? Last year, their two toughest games, Bama and Georgia, they lost them both. Again, this is something that seems obvious, okay? But it's a credit to Lane Kiffin. Winning all the games you're supposed to win is not easy. Think about all the upsets you see in college football every single week. Ole Miss was not involved in a single one of them last year. Ole Miss won every game they were supposed to win. That is not easy to do. The next step, even harder to do, which is beat the teams that are slightly better than you. And no matter how you break these things down, a team like Bama and Georgia last year were better than Ole Miss. When we put the schedule up on their screen here in a few minutes, you're going to see a team or two that, from a talent perspective, are just clearly better than Ole Miss. That doesn't mean Ole Miss can't beat them. That doesn't mean that at all. Can they beat them? Something Lane Kiffin sort of up to this point has yet to prove. And then the last thing is the defense. The defense has got to play better. I think everybody kind of trusts Lane Kiffin offensively. He's got a great offensive mind. Jackson Dart coming back as basically a 5th or a 6th-year guy, 3 years at Ole Miss, has a ton of experience, can run the offense in his sleep. Losing Judkins hurts, but you get all your pass catchers back. Maybe that kind of helps to offset that a little bit. And hopefully, if you're Ole Miss, a couple of these transfer running backs hit as well, and you get good offensive line play. That would be the hope. But the defense is going to have to play better and keep you in some of these bigger games. All right, let's put the schedule up on the screen. I'm going to go through it game by game, and I'm going to give you a winner and a loser for every single week. They start out with 4 non-con games in a row, 3 of them at home, 1 on the road. Furman and Middle Tennessee State at home. Both of those should be easy wins. Furman is an FCS team. Middle Tennessee State, they're a group of 5 team, but don't really belong or shouldn't be competing with somebody like Ole Miss. No shade to Middle Tennessee, but again, this is not your granddaddy's Ole Miss team or your daddy's old. This isn't a 6-win Ole Miss team, and you're sitting around going, oh boy. If Middle Tennessee State catches them sleeping, maybe they can win. Ole Miss should win both of those games easily. Then they have a Power 5 opponent out of the ACC. It's Wake Forest, and it is a road game. I'm just not a buyer on Wake Forest this year. I do like Dave Clawson. I think he's a pretty decent coach. Not great. Doesn't get great talent, but every once in a while you look up at the end of the year and sort of Wake Forest has won more games than you thought maybe they would win. Definitely not a terrible coach, Clawson. Not on the level of Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss right now, though. I think Ole Miss goes in there and gets the win. They're 3-0. Come back home, Georgia Southern. This is probably the toughest, might be the toughest of the non-con games. I don't know, man. We'll see how good Wake Forest ends up being. But Georgia Southern puts together some good teams every once in a while. They did beat Nebraska a couple of years ago, so they've got sort of a recent Power 5 win. I believe that was 2 seasons ago. They beat Nebraska in Lincoln. But again, Lane Kiffin has gotten to the point where he is beating the majority of teams he's supposed to beat, right? I don't expect that to change against Georgia Southern. I think Ole Miss cruises through their non-con schedule. They're 4-0. And then SEC play kicks off at home against Kentucky. Kentucky's an interesting team because they're extremely physical. And this is what has bothered Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin up to this point. If you look at last year, the 2 most physical teams they played, Georgia and Bama, they lost both of them. Now, Georgia and Bama, in addition to being physical, are also 2 of the most talented teams on the planet, something that Kentucky cannot say. But they're a very physical team. They have good lines of scrimmage. They're disciplined. They're very well coached under Stoops. And if you believe the Kentucky fans, this is finally the year they have a bunch of legitimate wide receivers. Now, they've been saying that every offseason for a while, and it's yet to sort of pan out. On top of that, they've brought in another quarterback out of the portal. This will be, I believe, the 3rd portal quarterback in a row to get the starting nod for Kentucky at quarterback under Stoops. They got the guy from Penn State a couple of years ago, Will Levis, was that his name? Last year, they brought in the guy from NC State, Leary, and now Brock Bowers. Brock Vandergriff, who has been the 2nd/3rd string QB at Georgia for the last couple of years. He is a 4th-year guy, so he had already been at Georgia for 3 seasons. Of course, currently behind Carson Beck there, who decided to come back for another year. Had Carson Beck gone pro after last year, Vandergriff would have stayed at UGA and been the assumed starter for this season. When Carson Beck announced that he was coming back to Georgia for his final year, Brock Vandergriff decided to hit the transfer portal. Extremely talented guy with next to no game experience at all. He has played in several games, but it's been the 4th quarter and the second half of blowouts against lower rung teams, FCS teams, things like that. He can do a lot of running around. He's a big body with a big arm, very highly recruited. Lincoln Riley in Oklahoma went after him years ago when he was coming out of high school. And, we've had plenty to say about Lincoln Riley. But he knows quarterbacks. And if Lincoln Riley wants you, chances are you're pretty good. He was committed there for a while, ended up committing to Georgia, where he's sort of been stuck behind a couple of different starters during his time there. But I think he's got the ability to be a really good quarterback. We'll see. Again, when you never seen a guy do it in college, it's hard to be 100% confident in that. But Kentucky could be a good team this year. They play good defense. I don't have a question about that. Great lines of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. I got no questions about that. Wide receivers and quarterback play. This is a tricky game for Ole Miss. It's at home, and that's a big help for Ole Miss, but I do think this is a tricky game. By this point in the season, Kentucky will have already played Georgia, a game they will probably lose. So Kentucky will be sitting on probably one loss at this point here. Backs against the wall mentality. I've got Ole Miss beating Kentucky, but I came close to picking this as an upset and going with Kentucky. This could be a great game. I'm giving Ole Miss the win there. On the road at South Carolina, this is a team I'm not expecting much out of this year. They lost Spencer Rattler. Lenore Sellers, is that his name, is going to be the QB there. A lot of running around, but they've got bad offensive and defensive lines. They can't run the ball. They can't stop the run. It's a multi-year problem. Shane Beamer getting close to the hot seat there. Not a lot of talent. It is on the road, and that can be a difficult place to play, especially if that ends up being a night game. Can be a difficult place to play because the thing about the South Carolina fans, they're loyal, extremely loyal. They don't care whether the team is 0-12 or 12-0. They're going to show up and they're going to be loud. It can be a difficult place to play. Again, I get back to the same thing here. It seems like Lane Kiffin has gotten to the point where he's beating the teams he's supposed to beat, and they're supposed to beat South Carolina. I'm giving them a win. On the road at LSU, right before a bye week, this is where I have Lane Kiffin dropping their first game. Back-to-back road games is always difficult. Back-to-back road games in the SEC is really difficult, and you're playing in two of the most difficult environments within the SEC, South Carolina and LSU. South Carolina, like I said, their fans are nuts. It doesn't matter what the team's record is, and everybody from coast to coast knows how difficult it is to play at LSU again, especially if that ends up being a night game. I'm not extremely high on LSU this year. I think they still have a lot of defensive problems. I like Nussmeier as a pocket QB, but he's not going to put up the numbers that Jaden Daniels did. I just feel like back-to-back road games here in two difficult environments, likely to lose one of them. And out of those two, I think LSU is the most likely loss. I've got you dropping that one on the road to the Tigers. Then you have a bye week. Everybody gets 2 bye weeks this year, so that's your first of 2 bye weeks, and you come out of that and you host newbie to the SEC, Oklahoma. I think you beat Oklahoma. Oklahoma and LSU, to me, are similar teams. I think they're going to, well, I won't say they're similar teams. I think they're going to have similar records. You go and you look at their schedules. They both look like teams that are going 7-5, 8-4, somewhere in that range. Maybe one of them wins a game or two they're not supposed to and gets to 9 wins, but they look like sort of 7-8 win teams to me. So I've got you splitting the difference between those two. LSU was on the road, so I gave you a loss there. Oklahoma follows a bye week, so getting back to Missouri's depth, their potential depth issues. Having a bye week, of course, is huge. If you've got players that are dinged up, nicked, slightly injured, whatever the case, an extra week of rest here before hosting Oklahoma, which will be a big game. And I'm giving Ole Miss the nod there. I think you beat the Sooners. On the road at Arkansas, you'll beat Arkansas. There's just no way you're losing that game. I'm sorry. Arkansas is not very good. They're going to struggle. Sam Pittman, I think, will be out of a job by the time this season is over. They've already brought what's his name in to run the offense from Texas A&M. He was the coach there before. He had the motorcycle. Bobby Petrino. I like Sam Pittman, a hell of a guy and a great offensive line coach. Hasn't worked out for him at Arkansas as a head coach, though. I think he's on the way out after this year. Tough time for him there. I think he'll go to Arkansas and get the win. So still just the one loss with 3 games to go. Georgia at home, Florida on the road, Mississippi State at home, the Egg Bowl. Georgia at home. I think Ole Miss wins this game. This is the biggest game of the year for Ole Miss, period. There are other big games on here. The LSU game at potentially could be big. The Oklahoma game will be big, obviously. It's a big brand in Oklahoma, new to the SEC, a lot of interest. Florida game, I don't know how big of a game that will be late in the year. They probably won't even have a coach by the time that game is played. The UGA game, well, the Egg Bowl is a different beast all in and of itself. I understand the Egg Bowl. Believe me, I love why I watch that game every Thursday night. It's part of my Thanksgiving tradition now. I love that game, so I'm not belittling that game. But in terms of winning the SEC, getting to the postseason seeding, things like that, the Georgia game is the biggest game of the year. It's at home for Ole Miss. I think their entire season leads up to this game, and I think they get a big win against the Dogs. Yes, Georgia blew them out last year in Athens. One of the most difficult places to play in the SEC. They caught Georgia at a time where Georgia was red hot, and it got away from them early in that game, and they were never able to recover. They're going to have to come up with something different in this one at home if they're going to win it. I don't think they're winning a shootout. If Georgia scores in the 40s, they're going to win again. Georgia's going to have another really good defense. This is where Ole Miss's defense has really got to come into its own here. Georgia averaged about 41 points a game last year. They were a top 5 offense in terms of points per game and total offense. They've got to find a way to slow that down. If they can hold Georgia to somewhere in the 20s, which has sort of been the Alabama model over the years, I think they've got a chance to win this game. I'm giving Ole Miss the benefit of the doubt because it's at home, and I just don't think anybody's going undefeated in the SEC. You might have already seen my Georgia prediction video. If you have, then you already knew I had Ole Miss beating Georgia. I just don't think anybody's going undefeated in the regular season. The schedules have been tossed on their heads. The addition of Texas and Oklahoma, it's hard to could someone go undefeated? Of course, there's 2 or 3 teams I think that have the capability of going undefeated. But as far as predicting it, no, I can't do that this year. So this is the game. I've got Georgia losing and Ole Miss winning. I got Ole Miss getting one of their biggest home wins probably ever against what could be a number 1 ranked Georgia Bulldog team. Then you have your second bye week, come out of that, play on the road at Florida, a team that probably won't have a coach at that point in the year. You'll beat them. Back home for the Egg Bowl, where you will win. Mississippi State headed in the wrong direction. That's it. I've got Ole Miss at 11-1. If you're curious, I've done almost every team in the SEC now. If you're curious, I've got Ole Miss at 11-1. I've got Georgia at 11-1. I've got Missouri at 9-3. I've got Texas, Bama, and Tennessee all at 10-2. If that ends up happening, then we will see Georgia versus Ole Miss rematch, SEC title game in Atlanta the first Saturday in December. There you go. Ole Miss 11-1, a loss on the road at LSU halfway through the season, a big home win against Georgia in November, and a probable trip to the SEC championship game. All right, appreciate you watching. Let me know down below how stupid I am, and have a good morning.